Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared is a puppet-based horror web series created by Becky Sloan and Joseph Pelling. It released its first episode in 2011 and ran until 2016. The series has recently, or somewhat recently, been picked up by Channel 4 in the UK, who originally commissioned the second episode of the first run. The creators are former art school students, meaning they know exactly how to keep things vague and playful in behind-the-scenes featurettes and such.
But to tell a story that is this unique, we needed to be just as unique in our approach.
And to tell a story that's this unique, we needed to be just as unique in our approach.
The show follows three friends as they are greeted by different characters who seem to offer educational information about basic concepts, except that all the information is incorrect and nonsensical. But I'm not here just to talk about the show or analyze its potential meaning, though there will be some of that. Instead, I'm going to focus on how Don't Hug Me is accessible experimentation. It's weird and experimental, but also accessible, which lets more people engage with it as a result. In fact, it might even convince more people to check out some weirdo art house movies. So let's get into it. Is that a good intro catchphrase? I feel like it's pretty overdone.
Rap snitches, telling all their business, sitting.
When it comes to my own media preferences, I'm in kind of an in-between space where I enjoy a lot of different stuff, and even my friends tend to fall into two major categories when it comes to what they watch. Some of them stick to more contemporary, accessible stuff, and other ones are deep in heavy-hitting art house fancy town. It's not that one type of media is better than the other, they just offer different flavors of good. Thing is, accessible, zeitgeisty media is typically more inviting, and it doesn't take much convincing to get someone to try it out. But foreign and art house material is more than a little intimidating for any number of reasons. For a while now, I've talked to the more art housey friends about how we can get more people to try out movies that aren't especially accessible, at least on the surface, because over in art house land, there's some really good stuff. Like really good. And one way to do that is to make the community surrounding these movies way less snobby and gatekeepy, but another very important part of the strategy is using gateway media to let people get a taste for the fancy stuff without making them drink from the caviar hose. These metaphors, man, I don't know. The term gateway media is pretty self-explanatory, but I'll give some examples just for fun. It's a reference to a gateway drug, just in a much more positive way. It introduces a new realm of things while still being relatively accessible itself. Jay from Red Letter Media has talked about movies like The Gate acting as gateway horror movies for kids. These movies can get kids interested in the larger horror genre without exposing them to the gratuitous gore and psychological torment of several genre favorites. Similarly, the Pokemon games are sometimes called gateway games for JRPGs, because a lot of JRPGs get way more complicated than Pokemon, but they do share basic elements of gameplay. A series of unfortunate events is gateway postmodernism, kinda. And to finally get around to my point, I think that the Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared series is a gateway art house. Before I get into the argument, it's important to outline some key qualities of the art house genre, which isn't really a genre at all. It's more of a vague, subjective category, and actually all of this is very subjective, so just keep that in mind as we go along. But for me, art house work can be identified by the following qualities. Number one, overall quality, usually technical quality. Art house movies look great, they sound great, and the really good ones still manage to look new or fresh decades after release. Number two, innovation. This might mean innovative storytelling, i.e. nonlinear narrative, or the lack of a narrative completely, or it might mean innovative or unconventional techniques when it comes to the visuals, performances, and sound. Number three, cultural impact. Cultural impact is really hard to quantify, but it's true that most art house movies are described as having special relevance and value to the surrounding culture. Another way to think of this one is that these movies are memorable for whatever reason, regardless of how many people actually watch them upon release. Number four, serious and relevant subject matter. This is one quality that I wish hadn't become a defining factor for art house media, but it has. The vast majority of movies that would be labeled as art house are going to be some kind of drama for the most part. The more serious, the more miserable, the better. Even art house comedies tend to have something to say about very far-reaching subjects and ideas. Number five, invitation to engage. This is is the most abstract quality on the list. Basically, it means that the media itself seems to entice viewers to engage with it on a deeper level, whether it's heightened attention during the viewing experience, or additional research after the movie is over, or attempts to assign meaning to specific elements and interpret everything. Yeah, you can interpret literally anything from the breakfast you ate this morning to the design of a stop sign. I just think that something like Jean Dielman invites more engagement than a garbage can on the side of the road on trash day. So people can argue with me about this list all they want, but these traits apply to just about every art house thing that I can think of, and they work well with my argument, so I'm going to stick with them. And just for good measure, here are some qualities that I think do not define art house movies at all. 1. Foreign. Art house movies can come from anywhere, even here in the US, and they can be made by anyone, not just by rich people in Kashmir who have a boat named Valencia. Number 2, old. Art house movies are still being made all the time. It's not something that has passed us by. Number 3, confusing. Lots of my favorite art house movies are pretty straightforward, even when they take a bit of work to interpret and engage with. Okay, cool. So let's keep this list in mind as I talk about Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, because at least for me, the series ticks all of these boxes over here on the good side of things. So before I launch in, I'm going to assume that you've seen the series, because I'm going to spoil a lot of stuff, and it is genuinely worth watching in general. And it doesn't take very long either, so just go ahead and do that if you haven't already. So let's start with that very first bullet point, overall quality. For much of the series, the visual style was dictated by kids' show standards, but it still has its own feel, even apart from the meat and gore, and I've always been especially impressed by all the tiny details in the props and the sets. Still, the individual elements of the visuals and the sound design aren't mind-blowing. It's more about how these elements are combined. A standout is definitely episode 4, the computer episode. The series switches to CG without a hitch, and it even manages to maintain that same lovable, creepy tone that is a hallmark of the series. But if we look at the whole show, I think we can easily say that Don't Hug Me is of quality. There's never the feeling that the production is amateurish or that decisions were being made in the spur of the moment. One way that I like to think of quality in movies is when you're made to feel like you're in good hands. Nothing feels flimsy or cheap. You know that there are smart, highly skilled people behind the camera, and that makes the viewing experience a whole lot better. I don't think this section is all that complicated, so I'm just gonna move on now. Here's a statement. There's nothing out there quite like Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. Now, there are lots of shorts and skits that take a children's show format and make it very much not for children. That's nothing new. There have even been puppet-led adult comedy properties before. Avenue Q and Wonder Shows definitely come to mind. But Don't Hug Me dug into a very specific niche. For a start, it was very strong horror comedy, a subgenre that more or less had its heyday in the 80s. And the subject matter explored in the show always stemmed from topics that would actually be covered in real kids shows, whereas Wonder Chosen and Avenue Q focused instead on saying naughty words and talking about drugs. And as with other aspects of the series that we'll get to later, Don't Hug Me really started to set itself apart towards the end. That really basic concept of taking a kids show format and making it all f***ed up doesn't really do much for me. It's alright, and as I just talked about, Don't Hug Me does this in a way that's somewhat novel, but the real meat is what the show becomes and what it starts to be about. It's hard to judge the cultural impact of any work of art when it's still somewhat recent, but the viewership numbers alone show that Don't Hug Me was massively popular during a time when the internet was still carving out its own sense of humor. Memes were still a relatively new concept, and it was very rare for any viral content to also have any kind of production value. Yes, these were YouTube videos, but they were also short films. Pretty weird short films, and they still found a massive audience that went on to create all sorts of fan art, theories, and reaction videos. We could even say that Don't Hug Me opened the door for a whole host of online content that examines and critiques the children's entertainment of the 90s, especially entertainment that has something mildly creepy about it, and that content is still going strong today, for better or worse. Cultural impact doesn't mean that everyone liked something, it just means that the art had, well, an impact. And in my eyes, Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared meets that criteria with flying colors, or weird, fuzzy, furry colors. One of the two. This brings us to the part where I talk about number 4 and number 5 at the same time. Subject matter and invitation to engage. And it's going to be a long one, so strap in, it's going to be great. Really, this is the point where I'm going to share my own interpretation of the overall series and do some good old-fashioned analysis, because it's been a while. To many people, there's something very appealing about a piece of media that doesn't serve up all the answers on a platter. This is media that's coy, aloof, enticing viewers to dig a little bit deeper to figure it all out. There's also plenty of room for art that doesn't provide answers or that doesn't have answers, period. It doesn't have to mean anything at all. Them's just the breaks. But humans typically like to make connections, identify patterns, and feel like they understand things, especially if they've invested some time into them. Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared does a great job of implying deeper layers of meaning without ever really giving too many hints, which in turn leaves tons of room for interpretation. Compare this to something like Gravity Falls, a cartoon show with very explicit hidden information and lore. It places secret codes at the ends of episodes, and there are very specific answers to be found if you take the time to look around. Oh, sorry for the rhyme. Don't Hug Me is way more open-ended, which immediately puts it closer to art house territory. The last episode of the series definitely sheds a lot of light, but it doesn't limit the discussion either. But you can bet that a ton of people who watched this little web series had a painful itch to figure it all out, and that's what I mean when I use the term invitation to engage. Somebody said that a great movie starts after you leave the theater. Don't ask me who it was, because I don't remember who it was. You just feel compelled to keep thinking and talking about it, and I think that applies 100% to Don't Hug Me. And you see evidence of this all over the internet, or at least you really did when the series was still hot off the presses. There were just so many explainer videos and forum threads filled with people asking questions, or flat out telling people that they had the only correct reading of the show, which kind of goes against the spirit of things. But as for the serious subject matter bullet point, I'd like to offer my own interpretation of the show, one that has almost definitely been presented before by someone else. There's just a lot of interpretations out there, so it's kind of inevitable. On the surface level, Don't Hug Me definitely contains very serious subject matter thanks to the violent imagery and broad strokes topics. But for me, it's in the analysis that Don't Hug Me presents a convincing case for being seen as more than a silly little web series. In my eyes, Don't Hug Me is a reflection of the process of making art, and more specifically, the process of making art when there are tons and tons of expectations getting in your way, or trying to get in your way. It's not a brand new topic, but I think it carries special relevance here because of its relation to internet media. Now, in the real world, we see artists fighting against expectations all the time. It's super common in mainstream music, for example. You see artists not wanting to be defined by a former song or persona or whatever. David Bowie changed his look and onstage presence quite often. This one here is my favorite one. Miley didn't want to be seen as a kiddo anymore, so she got all edgelord over everything. Radiohead hated how much everybody loved Creep, so they just refused to play it. But I really enjoy when artists talk about this dilemma in the work itself rather than only addressing it at the meta career level. Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared chomps down on that topic pretty hard. In the first episode, it's a no-brainer. The song is about being creative, but the mysterious notepad thing gives contradictory rules, most notably, green is not a creative color. And after things get real weird towards the end of the episode, the notepad tries to make a pact that they'll never be creative again. The kids show context gives this reading some extra spice. I don't have the expertise to speak about art education for children, but based on personal experience at least, I do think there's some room for criticism in that area. There are a few good years during childhood when there's no real pressure to specialize in a certain thing. You can do all kinds of different activities because who cares? It's not super relevant, you're just a kid. But at a certain age, kids are way less likely to do things that they're not already good at. Part of that might be social pressure, as described by this clip from Lorda Miller.
Working on the Lego movie, this was a major question that we were asking, which is what happens between the age of 7 and 17? You learn how to be embarrassed, right? When you're like 4 years old, you don't know what that is. But by the time you get to be 10 or 11, you start to understand the social implications of telling a joke that doesn't land or having an idea that other people don't like. And the other thing that happens is you start to learn about the classics. You go from like thinking that like anyone can be creative to thinking that like creative people like have to look real handsome and be really good at what they do.
But I think another force at play is the dominant understanding of the real purpose of education. At least here in the US, the real purpose of education is to prepare people for lucrative careers. It's really not education for education's sake. In other words, teens getting ready for college or the workforce are discouraged from sinking a lot of time into creative endeavors unless there's some kind of money-making potential there. I know these are big generalizations, but I think they hold true for a lot of people. And if you do decide to study the arts in college and beyond, there are always going to be limitations to your creativity, the biggest of which is just commercial viability. There are indeed some artists out there who find mainstream success simply by doing whatever they want, but that's pretty darn rare, and it really only happens if their work happens to line up with mainstream interests of the time, or if people are more into the artist's personal branding than the work. But that's a huge topic. All I'm saying here is that for people who want to make and sell art of any kind, there's always going to be a push and pull between pure expression and commercial viability. The first episode of Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared looks at the topic in a pretty straightforward way. It establishes that core contradiction, but doesn't do a whole lot else. A lot of the strength comes from the shock factor, but the narrative is extremely basic, and then it's over. But the idea starts to develop a lot more in the subsequent episodes, and I feel that's because the creators behind the project were trying to cope with their own viral success. Maybe the creators expected it to go viral, but I think it's more likely that they were surprised at just how successful that first episode was. It was mega successful. While viewership fell off steeply after the first installment, 20+ million viewers is still a lot of attention. And as a viral thing with a very specific shtick, how much room did the team really have to mess around in? If the series suddenly dropped the horror aspect and creepy Lynchian moments, would it even feel like the same show? And at the same time, if the episodes followed the exact same formula, it would probably get old fast. The next episode I'd like to focus on is episode 4, Computer. For one thing, it has one of my favorite songs in the series, but I also see it as expressing the pretty significant limitations of making content for the internet. Specifically, there's the moment where the uninvited beige box computer says, "In the digital world, there's 3 things to do." And no, the internet isn't limited to the 3 activities they describe here, but I think it's a clever way to illustrate how the online space, which is regularly touted as being effectively endless, has its own set of limitations as well. And if we bring it back to the art-making dilemma, there's definitely a precedent for homogenization. This is something I'd like to talk about another time, but just to cover the basics, all of the major social media platforms use their algorithms to figure out what kind of stuff tends to keep people on the service, and it does whatever it can to promote similar content in the hopes of maintaining attention, and more importantly, usage. This used to mean that existing content that matched those parameters would get pushed to the top because it serves the platform's purpose to a T. But nowadays, lots of people have those limitations in mind when making something, so there's less real variety overall because anything outside the ruts of previous successful content probably won't see the light of day. This is even impacting how people write music now, carefully crafting songs so that they're more likely to be chosen for official Spotify playlists that are themselves based on what has gotten the highest numbers of listens in the past. I know this is a lot of information, but I think it's possible the Don't Hug Me team was speaking to the lack of flexibility, whether their own lack of flexibility within the series or larger boundaries that have been placed on the internet in general. But of course, it's the final episode that brings all of this stuff to a head. It's very much about creativity once again, and it uses the song from the first episode multiple times. It also gives us a visual representation of the audience with a capital A. These people are the idea of the audience, a generalization of trying to share your work. For plenty of artists, performing or posting or sharing work for the first time is going to attract a certain amount of criticism, if not total indifference. Our red guy here, does he have a name? I don't think he has a name. Goes out on a limb to perform a fun and silly song without clothes on, which further emphasizes his state of vulnerability. He doesn't have some killer song that's going to blow everyone away, and in fact, it feels like a much inferior version of the song compared to what we hear in the first episode. But the series takes its most surreal turn yet, with the red guy venturing into the bowels of, I don't know, the internet, reality, and here he finds machinery displaying the yellow guy who's still being assaulted by colorful edutainment edutainment characters. This is presumably the control station from which the other edutainment characters and their music have been introduced into the lives of our leads. The yellow guy's dad is here as well. This character has had an unnerving presence in several previous episodes. The scene implies that he's in control of everything they've been experiencing since the start of the series. Then, in what might be the red guy's most active moment in the show, he disconnects a comically large electrical plug, which apparently resets the show that we've all been watching the whole time, and the calendar on the wall, at long last, finally moves on to the next day. Okay, so that's a lot, but it still fits into my reading of the series. This is the red guy's moment of self-actualization and agency, and let's not forget that the red guy is acting as a stand-in for the artist in a broad symbolic sense. The artist sees that they aren't in control and decides it would be better to stop broadcasting, to stop sharing the work at all, at least in this way. We can also very easily see this moment here in the final episode of the series, as the creators reflecting on their past work and having maybe some negative feelings about that work. It might be disappointment, detachment, or a simple desire to move on to something different. Or we could see this as an illustration of looking back at popular online content. At a certain point, it might feel like the platform, or the audience, or someone else entirely, is more in control of what happens with the art than the people who made it. However we look at this, it does seem to be a clear act of defiance against some form of the establishment. And as for the altered characters that we see after the reset, this illustrates just how replaceable those characters were, and by extension, how replaceable artists and creators are within the context of social media and the internet in general. There will always be something else to look at. There might even be a bunch of people ready to make the kind of stuff you were making. The red guy's small act of rebellion isn't effective. So I know that last section was kind of long, but again, this isn't just about my interpretation of the show, but about how fun and satisfying it is to analyze and interpret a work of art. And for me at least, movies labeled as art house tend to be a lot more rewarding when you dig into them. So all of that was to argue that Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared qualifies as art house filmmaking, but that's just one part of what I want to say here. The other side of the equation is talking about how the series is just very accessible, and how, in turn, it gives a lot of viewers a taste of art house style work. The biggest argument in favor of Don't Hug Me's accessibility is just the sheer number of views the series has gotten. All those views were generated while the creators still had complete creative control and didn't make any big compromises to make it more marketable. Part of the appeal is definitely just that central hook. Like a lot of viral content, the series has one big twist that you can easily explain to a friend, or at least hint at so they might be motivated to check it out for themselves. It's bright and colorful and genuinely funny, as well as being disturbing, but when people really sat down with the show, they noticed how much there was to dig into. These two ingredients, the accessibility and the depth, worked together to get people to watch something that's ultimately a lot more creative and compelling than a lot of other stuff on YouTube. If it wasn't already obvious, it's hard to get people to engage with slower, more thoughtful content, but once someone gets a taste of the good stuff, they're probably gonna want more. At least in this case, art house movies are the more, along with lots of other slow-paced pieces of art that fall under many different labels. Thanks for sticking around until this part of the video, and I don't have too much else to mention right now. As always, talk to me in the comments, maybe check out some other things I've done if you feel like it, and thanks for stopping by. Also, is puppeteering animation? Like, is it a kind of animation to do puppet things? I was gonna put that at the beginning, but I'm gonna put it at the end where two people actually see it. I don't know, I've just been thinking about that lately.